The space station Meridian Gate hung in the void like a massive metal flower, its rotating sections catching the light of three distant suns. Trade ships from dozens of species docked at its ports daily, making it one of the most diverse locations in the known galaxy. The station served as neutral ground where ancient enemies could conduct business without fear of war spilling into commerce. In the lower decks, where the air was thick with engine fumes and the smell of exotic foods, a cantina called the Broken Chain served as the unofficial meeting place for mercenaries, traders, and those seeking to disappear from their past. The lighting was dim, the music was loud, and the drinks were strong enough to knock out a ox. Sat alone at a corner table, nursing a glass of synthetic whiskey. His weathered hands showed the calluses of someone who had held weapons more than most people held eating utensils. At 45, his black hair was streaked with premature silver, and his brown eyes held the distant look of someone who had seen too much. The simple gray jumpsuit he wore bore no insignia, no rank markers, nothing to indicate his past service in the human colonial defense force. He preferred it that way. The cantina was busier than usual tonight. A trade delegation from the Empire had arrived that morning, bringing with them the usual collection of nobles, diplomats, and hangers-on. They were an old race, proud of their reptilian heritage and their mastery of atmospheric flight. They called themselves dragons, though had seen real dragons on 442b, and the comparison was generous at best. 3 tables away, a group of young held court, their scaled skin gleaming under the cantina's lights. They wore the elaborate robes of the noble class, all silk and precious metals, with ceremonial weapons that had never seen real combat. Their voices carried over the ambient noise as they regaled anyone who would listen with stories of their glory. At the center of the group sat Prince, 19 years old and heir to one of its most powerful provinces. His scales were a deep emerald green, marking him as royalty, and his golden eyes held the arrogance that came with never being told no in his entire life. The ceremonial sword at his hip was worth more than most beings made in a year, its hilt encrusted with gems that sparkled like captured starlight. And then, Prince was saying, his voice pitched to carry across the cantina, I told the ambassador that if his people wanted safe passage through space, they would need to pay proper tribute. You should have seen how quickly he agreed when I showed him the might of our fleet. His companions laughed on cue, their laughter sharp and grating, took another sip of his whiskey and tried to ignore them. He had come here for peace and quiet, not to listen to a spoiled princeling boast about imaginary conquests. Of course, the prince continued, not all species understand the proper respect due to superior beings. Take the humans, for example. Pathetic little creatures who think their crude technology makes them equals to their betters. His hand tightened slightly around his glass, but he kept his expression neutral. He had heard worse from better people. I heard, said one of the prince's companions, a thin with blue-tinted scales, that humans claim to have won something called the Void War single-handedly. As if such primitive beings could accomplish anything noteworthy. Prince's laughter was like glass breaking. The Void War, that minor skirmish with the darkness entities, my grandfather's hunting expeditions were more challenging. Humans simply happened to be in the right place when more civilized species had already done the real work. The Void War closed his eyes for a moment, remembering. 30 years ago, when humanity had barely begun to explore beyond their own solar system, the darkness had emerged from the space between galaxies. Entities of pure malevolence and hunger, they had consumed entire star systems before anyone understood what they were facing. The established galactic powers had fought them for 2 years and lost ground steadily. Planets fell, species went extinct, and panic spread through civilized space like wildfire. Then humanity had entered the war, bringing with them a desperate innovation born from their violent history and their talent for turning anything into a weapon. Had been there, he had been 22 years old, fresh out of basic training, when the darkness had hit the Tau system. He remembered the screaming of his squad mates as shadow creatures tore through their lines. He remembered the weight of the plasma rifle in his hands as he held a position that should have been abandoned hours before. He remembered the faces of the civilians they had evacuated, looking at human soldiers like they were their only hope in a universe gone mad. The truth is, Prince was saying, warming to his topic, humans are barely above animals in intelligence. They have no culture, no art, no appreciation for the finer things. They breed like vermin and spread across the galaxy like a plague, bringing their crude ways to civilized worlds. Several other patrons had started listening now, noticed a trader nodding along, and a group of merchants muttering agreement. Humans were relatively new to galactic society, having only achieved faster than light travel 60 years ago. They were still viewed by many older species as upstart primitives. "I've heard," said another of the prince's companions, this one with red scales that marked her as minor nobility, "that human soldiers are cowards who hide behind their machines instead of facing their enemies with honor." "Of course they are," Prince agreed. "Any species that relies on crude projectile weapons instead of proper energy swords lacks true warrior spirit. I could defeat a dozen human soldiers without breaking a sweat." Set down his glass carefully. The whiskey tasted like ash in his mouth now. He could feel the familiar tension building in his shoulders, the old combat reflexes stirring to life after years of careful suppression. He had come to the broken chain to forget, not to remember. "In fact," the prince continued, his voice growing louder with each word, "I challenge any human in this establishment to prove otherwise. Come, face me in honorable combat, and I will show everyone here what superior breeding and training can accomplish." The cantina fell silent. Conversations died mid-sentence as every eye turned toward the prince's table. Could feel the weight of their gazes, the expectation hanging in the air like smoke. Somewhere in the crowd, he heard someone whisper, "Is that human going to answer?" Stood slowly, his chair scraping against the metal floor. The movement was deliberate, unhurried, like a man with all the time in the world. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small credit chip, placing it on the table next to his unfinished drink. Prince's golden eyes locked onto him, and a predatory smile spread across his scaled features. "Ah, finally, a human with enough spine to accept a proper challenge. Tell me your name, little mammal, so I know what to carve on your memorial stone." Looked at him for a long moment, studying the young prince's face. He saw the arrogance there, the absolute certainty of victory, the casual cruelty of someone who had never faced real consequences for his actions. It was the look of a being who had been told from birth that he was special, chosen, destined for greatness. It was the same look had seen on the faces of 1,000 enemies over the years. "No," said quietly, his voice carrying in the sudden silence. Prince blinked, clearly not expecting that response. "Excuse me." I said no, turned and walked toward the exit, his footsteps echoing in the hushed cantina. "You dare walk away from me?" The prince's voice cracked with indignation. "Come back here, coward, face me like a warrior." Paused at the cantina's entrance but didn't turn around. "Kid," he said, his voice still quiet but somehow carrying to every corner of the room, "I've killed things that would use you as a toothpick. I've fought in battles where the enemy literally ate planets for breakfast. I've stood in the fire of guns that could crack moons in half, and I've walked through the blood of friends whose names are carved on memorial walls across 3 sectors." He glanced back over his shoulder, and for just a moment, his carefully maintained mask slipped. Prince saw something in those brown eyes that made his scales ripple with involuntary fear. "You want to know why I won't fight you?" Continued. "Because you're 19 years old, you've never been in a real battle, and killing you wouldn't prove anything except that I'm a bitter old soldier who can't let go of his past. Find yourself a real war to fight in, Prince. Then maybe we can talk." With that, he walked out of the cantina, leaving behind a room full of stunned silence and one very confused dragon prince. Prince sat frozen for several heartbeats, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. No one had ever spoken to him that way. No one had ever dismissed him so completely, so casually. The human's words echoed in his head. "I've killed things that would use you as a toothpick." Did he just call me a child?" the prince whispered. His companions shifted uncomfortably. Lady, the red-scaled noble, cleared her throat delicately. "Perhaps, Your Highness, we should return to the diplomatic quarter. The trade negotiations begin early tomorrow." But Prince wasn't listening. His golden eyes were fixed on the cantina's entrance, and his hands were clenched into fists. In his 19 years of life, he had never been so thoroughly humiliated. The human had looked at him like he was nothing, like he was a spoiled child playing with toys. "I've stood in the fire of guns that could crack moons in half." What kind of war had the human been talking about? The Void War, obviously, but Prince had been taught that it was a minor conflict, easily resolved by the superior technology and tactics of the established galactic powers. His tutors had mentioned human participation only in passing, as a footnote to the real story. But the way the human had spoken, the look in his eyes, that wasn't the voice of someone describing a minor skirmish. That was the voice of someone who had walked through hell and somehow come out the other side. Your Highness, Lady prompted gently. Prince stood abruptly, nearly knocking over his chair. I want to know everything about that human, he said. Everything. His name, his service record, his part in this void war he mentioned. I want it by morning. Sir, the trade negotiations. Can wait. The prince's voice carried an edge that made his companions fall silent. That human looked at me like I was nothing, like I was a joke. I want to know what gives him the right. As the delegation filed out of the cantina, the other patrons slowly returned to their conversations. But the atmosphere had changed. Several beings were looking toward the exit with new expressions, as if seeing something they hadn't noticed before. At the bar, an old freighter captain with cybernetic implants covering half his face shook his head slowly. Stupid kids, he muttered into his drink. They don't know what they're playing with. You know that human? Asked the bartender, a massive whose forearms moved in perfect synchronization as he cleaned glasses. I know the type, the replied. Seen a few of them over the years. They don't talk much about the war, and when they do, he took a long pull from his drink. Let's just say that Prince has no idea how lucky he is that soldier walked away. The bartender paused in his cleaning. You were there during the Void War. Periphery actions only, supply runs mostly. This remaining organic eye grew distant, but I saw enough. Saw what the humans did when the darkness reached Earth's system, saw what they became when they had their backs against the wall. He finished his drink and stood, tossing payment onto the bar. Mark my words, friend, that prince is going to dig into the wrong history, and when he does, he's going to learn why smart people don't provoke sleeping tigers. Meanwhile, made his way through the station's corridors, trying to shake off the memories that the prince's words had stirred up. The Meridian Gate never slept, and even at this hour, the passages were filled with beings going about their business. The familiar sounds of commerce and conversation washed over him, helping to ground him in the present. He had a small apartment in the civilian quarter, nothing fancy but clean and private. It was the kind of place where a man could disappear from his past and try to build something resembling a normal life. He had been doing a decent job of it too, until tonight. As he reached his door, paused and looked back down the corridor. Somewhere on this station, a 19-year-old prince was probably raging about being dismissed by a primitive human. The smart thing would be for the kid to let it go, to chalk it up to experience and move on with his privileged life. But had a feeling that Prince wasn't going to be smart about this. Stupid kid, he muttered, echoing the words from the cantina. He keyed in his door code and stepped inside, already knowing that his carefully maintained peace was about to be shattered. Behind him, the station continued its endless rotation, carrying with it the seeds of a confrontation that would force both a naive prince and a weary veteran to confront truths they had been avoiding. The first domino had fallen, the rest would follow soon enough. Prince paced his luxurious quarters aboard the diplomatic vessel Zephyr's Pride, his clawed feet leaving small scratches in the polished metal floor. The suite was a testament to wealth and taste, with silken tapestries depicting ancient battles and furniture carved from the crystalline trees of his. But none of its beauty could calm the storm raging in his mind. 18 hours had passed since his humiliation in the cantina, and every minute had felt like an eternity. The human's words echoed in his thoughts. I've killed things that would use you as a toothpick. The casual dismissal, the way those brown eyes had looked right through him as if he were nothing more than an irritating child. A soft chime announced a visitor. Enter, commanded, not breaking his pace. Lady glided into the room, her red scales catching the artificial sunlight that streamed through the viewport. In her hands, she carried a data tablet, its screen glowing with compiled information. Your Highness, I have what you requested. The prince stopped packing and turned to face her, his golden eyes blazing with anticipation. Tell me everything. Consulted her tablet, her expression troubled. His name is, formerly Staff Sergeant of the Human Colonial Defense Force. Age 45, born on Earth's colony world New Shanghai. He served for 25 years before taking early retirement 5 years ago. 25 years, repeated, that would put him in service during. The Void War, yes. His voice grew quieter. Your Highness, I think you should know that what our tutors taught us about that conflict may not have been complete. The prince's scales rippled with irritation. What do you mean? Instead of answering directly, manipulated her tablet, and a holographic display sprang to life in the center of the room. It showed a star map, with sectors marked in different colors. Red zones indicated areas lost to the darkness, yellow showed contested space, and green represented territories still under Allied control. This is the galactic situation 30 years ago, 6 months into the Void War, explained. The red areas represent systems completely consumed by the darkness entities. Studied the map, his confidence faltering. The red zones covered nearly a third of known space, including several major trade routes and core worlds of established civilizations. I was told the darkness threat was contained quickly. It was, said grimly, but not by us. She manipulated the display, fast forwarding through time. The red zones continued to expand for another year and a half, swallowing entire sectors. Then, suddenly, the expansion stopped. Green began pushing back against red, slowly at first, then with increasing speed. What changed? Asked, though he was beginning to suspect the answer. Humanity entered the war. The display zoomed in on a small section of space labeled Sol System Human Territory. They had been observers until this point, their space navy consisting of perhaps 50 vessels total. The Galactic Council had dismissed them as too primitive to be of assistance. The prince watched as the green zones began expanding faster, the red retreating. 50 ships couldn't have made that much difference. It wasn't the ships, said softly. It was what the humans did with them. Your Highness, I accessed restricted military archives from multiple species. The accounts, they're disturbing. She brought up a new file, this one marked with warning symbols in a dozen different languages. This is a report from Admiral, my great uncle. He was present at the Battle of Station. The hologram shifted to show a space station under siege, surrounded by writhing shadows that easy description. The darkness entities moved like living nightmares, their forms shifting between states of matter. Traditional energy weapons seemed to pass through them without effect. The darkness had adapted to our energy-based technology, continued. Plasma cannons, particle beams, even fusion missiles had minimal impact. The Allied fleet was preparing to retreat when the human task force arrived. New contacts appeared on the display. A small formation of crude-looking ships with angular designs and obvious weapon. They were dwarfed by the elegant curves of battle cruisers and the organic flowing lines of dreadnoughts. 57 human vessels against a darkness swarm that had just neutralized 300 Allied ships, read from the report. Admiral noted that the human ships looked like flying scrapyards held together by stubbornness and prayer. Prince leaned forward, despite himself drawn into the account. What happened? The humans opened fire with projectile weapons. Kinetic rounds, explosive shells, even chemical rockets. Technology that most species had abandoned thousands of years ago as primitive and inefficient. His voice took on a note of wonder. But it worked. The darkness entities, which had adapted to energy weapons, had no defense against simple mass and velocity. The display showed the human ships closing to point-blank range, their crude weapons tearing into the shadow creatures like knives through silk. Where elegant energy beams had failed, crude bullets and missiles succeeded. The human save station asked. That was just the beginning. Advanced the timeline. Once the Galactic Council realized that human weapons could harm the darkness, they began coordinating joint operations. The humans shared their technology freely, teaching other species how to manufacture kinetic weapons. The prince watched as the tide of war shifted dramatically. Human ship designs began appearing in Allied fleets, their angular ugliness somehow reassuring now. The red zones contracted faster and faster as the combined forces pushed the darkness back toward the galactic rim. But this doesn't explain why that soldier spoke as he did, said. You said he was a sergeant, not a ship captain. His expression grew even more troubled. That's where the records become difficult to read. The humans didn't just provide technology, Your Highness. They provided soldiers, boarding parties to clear infested ships, ground forces to retake contaminated planets. A new file opened, this one showing surface combat footage. Prince had seen war documentaries before, sanitized presentations that focused on strategy and heroism. This was different. The camera work was shaky, obviously recorded by someone in the middle of combat. Darkness entities swarmed across a ruined cityscape like living oil, their forms shifting and flowing around traditional cover. Then the human soldiers appeared. They moved through the nightmare landscape with purpose and discipline, their weapons chattering constantly. Where other species had tried to maintain distance and use superior firepower, the humans closed to melee range. They fought with knives, clubs, and improvised weapons when their guns ran dry. When darkness entities tried to possess them, the humans simply kept fighting until they could reach a teammate who could put them down. They never retreated, said quietly. According to every account I found, human ground forces never gave up a position voluntarily. They would hold until relieved or until they were all dead. There are records of human squads fighting for days without resupply, using enemy body parts as weapons when they ran out of ammunition. Prince stared at the footage, his worldview cracking. How many humans died in this war? The official casualty reports are classified, but I found partial records. Pulled up another file. Best estimates suggest that humanity lost approximately 40% of their military age population. 40%, Your Highness. No other species in galactic history has sustained those kinds of losses and continued fighting. The prince sank into a chair, his legs suddenly unsteady. 40%. The war lasted 3 years, continued. By the end, the humans weren't just providing soldiers, they were providing the doctrine that everyone else followed. Their concept of total war became the standard approach to fighting the darkness. When the last entity was destroyed at the Battle of Void's End, it was a human admiral who commanded the final assault. But our history books barely mention them, protested weakly. Because the humans didn't want glory, replied. After the war, they demobilized their expanded military and went back to their exploration and colonization efforts. They never demanded territorial concessions or war reparations. They just went home. The holographic display shifted to show post-war ceremonies. Representatives of dozens of species gathered to celebrate victory, but the human delegation was notably small and subdued. They accepted no special honors, claimed no conquered territories. They simply filed their final reports and departed. Many of their veterans were given the option to retire early with full benefits, read from her notes. Staff Sergeant was one of approximately 50,000 human soldiers who chose this path. He received 12 combat decorations, including the Star of Valor and our own Silver Talon of Honor. Prince head snapped up. He has a Silver Talon. Awarded for actions during the liberation of Prime's outer moon, confirmed. He led a squad that held the main communication array against a darkness assault for 72 hours. His actions allowed the evacuation of 12,000 civilian refugees. The prince stared at the medal record, understanding dawning on his scaled features. The Silver Talon was one of his people's highest military honors, awarded only for extraordinary heroism in the defense of lives. He had one in his personal collection, awarded to his grandfather for a hunting expedition that had saved a village from a rampaging beast. This human had earned his by holding a position for 3 days straight against creatures that literally consumed souls. There's more, said gently. According to the psychological evaluations in his retirement file, Staff Sergeant was diagnosed with severe combat stress and recommended for extended therapeutic treatment. The report notes that he had witnessed the deaths of over 200 fellow soldiers during his service. 200, whispered. His final mission report makes for difficult reading. I won't share the details, but it involved the rescue of survivors from a transport ship that had been partially consumed by a darkness entity. The report notes that Sergeant personally carried 17 injured civilians to safety through what was described as a literal hellscape of transformed matter and hostile entities. The prince buried his face in his hands, his earlier anger replaced by a growing sense of horror. And I called him a coward. I said humans had no warrior spirit. Your Highness said carefully, there's one more thing you should know. I found a personal log entry from Admiral recorded after the war ended. Would you like to hear it? Nodded, not trusting his voice. The hologram shifted to show an elderly in military dress, his scales dulled with age but his eyes still sharp. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of authority and experience. Personal log, Admiral, Imperial Navy. I have been asked by the Historical Council to provide my assessment of human military capabilities for future reference. I have served in the Imperial Navy for 60 years. I have commanded fleets in 7 major conflicts and countless minor actions. I have seen the best warriors of a dozen species, and I thought I understood the nature of courage and sacrifice. The humans taught me otherwise. They are not the strongest species, nor the fastest, nor the most technologically advanced. What they possess is something far more dangerous: the absolute refusal to accept defeat. I have watched human soldiers fight on with injuries that would cripple a. I have seen them charge enemy positions that any sane being would consider suicide. I have witnessed acts of heroism that border on madness. But it is not madness. It is something far more terrifying. It is the cold, calculated decision to pay any price, bear any burden, to protect what they consider worth protecting. When the darkness threatened Earth, every human became a potential soldier. When their colonies were attacked, they responded with a fury that shook the galaxy. I pray that humanity never again faces a threat that pushes them to such extremes. Not because I fear for humanity, but because I fear for whatever would be foolish enough to threaten them. End log. The recording faded, leaving Prince sitting in stunned silence. Everything he thought he knew about humans, about the war, about his place in the galaxy, had been shattered in the span of an hour. Your Highness, Lady said quietly, I believe Staff Sergeant was trying to be kind to you last night. Kind looked up, confusion evident in his golden eyes. He could have accepted your challenge. He could have humiliated you in front of the entire cantina, possibly injured or killed you. Instead, he walked away. He chose to spare you the lesson you were asking for. The prince stood slowly, his movements mechanical. Through the viewport, he could see the Meridian Gate rotating lazily against the. Somewhere on that station, a tired old soldier was trying to forget a war that had cost him everything. And yesterday, a foolish young prince had tried to drag him back into it. I need to find him, said. Your Highness, perhaps it would be better to let this matter rest. No, the prince's voice carried a new quality, something harder and more mature than had been there before. I challenged his honor based on ignorance and prejudice. I owe him an apology. Bowed slightly. As you wish. However, I should warn you that finding him may not be easy. According to station records, left the Meridian Gate early this morning aboard a freight hauler bound for the Rim territories. Prince's shoulders sagged. The human was gone, disappeared into the vast expanse of space, and the opportunity for redemption had vanished with him. Did he leave any indication of his destination? None that I could find. The freight hauler, Lucky Strike, is operated by a captain with a reputation for not asking questions about his passengers' business. The prince walked to the viewport and stared out at the stars. Somewhere out there, a man who had literally walked through hell was trying to find peace. And the last interaction he'd had with civilized society was a spoiled prince calling him a coward. Lady said quietly, I want you to compile everything we've learned about the Void War and the human contribution. Every record, every report, every personal account you can find. May I ask why, Your Highness? Because when we return to, I'm going to present it to the Historical Council. The truth should be told, not the sanitized version we've been teaching our children. He turned from the viewport, his expression grim, and because I want to understand what I saw in that man's eyes when he looked at me. Understanding, Your Highness. Terror, Prince said simply. Not terror of me, but terror of what he might do if he let himself remember who he used to be. That human wasn't afraid to fight me, lady. He was afraid he might enjoy it. The realization hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Outside, the stars continued their ancient dance, indifferent to the education of young princes and the sins of old soldiers. But in the luxury of his diplomatic suite, Prince began to understand that there were some lessons that could only be learned through loss, some truths that could only be gained by facing the darkness within oneself. And somewhere in the vast emptiness between stars, continued his journey toward a peace that seemed always just out of reach. The freight hauler Lucky Strike was 3 days out from Meridian Gate when its captain, a gruff named, noticed that his passenger spent most of his time staring out the cargo bay windows at the passing stars. The human had paid his passage in cash, asked no questions, and caused no trouble. In his experience, that usually meant someone was running from something. You know, said, approaching during the ship's night cycle, we'll be making a supply stop at Haven Station in 2 days. Nice place, quiet, the kind of world where a being can start over. Glanced at him, a slight smile playing at his lips. That obvious. I've been running freight for 40 years, the replied. You learn to read passengers. You've got the look of someone carrying too much weight. Yeah, said, returning his gaze to the stars. Something like that. But what neither of them knew was that the weight carried was about to become relevant again. In the Rim territories, where law was often a matter of interpretation and survival depended on strength, old skills had a way of proving their worth. The peace sought was still 3 systems away. And between here and there, the galaxy had other plans for a tired old soldier who just wanted to be left alone. Haven Station orbited a dead world at the edge of civilized space, its solar panels drinking in the weak light of an aging red giant star. The station served as a last stop for traders heading into the lawless Rim territories and a first refuge for those fleeing whatever they'd left behind in the inner systems. It was exactly the kind of place where someone could disappear, which made it perfect for purposes. Or so he had thought. The Lucky Strike docked without incident and gathered his few possessions, a single duffel bag containing everything he owned. Captain had been good company during the 3-day journey, sharing stories of the frontier worlds and asking no uncomfortable questions. As prepared to disembark, the captain handed him a data pad. Freight schedules for the next month, explained. If you decide Haven Station isn't quite remote enough, I can always use an extra hand. Pay's not great, but it beats whatever demons you're running from. Accepted the pad with a grateful nod. Thanks, I might take you up on that. Haven Station's main concourse was a far cry from the polished elegance of Meridian Gate. The corridors were narrow, the lighting functional rather than atmospheric, and the air recyclers worked just hard enough to keep the atmosphere breathable. Traders, miners, and refugees moved through the space with the purposeful efficiency of people who understood that the frontier didn't tolerate waste. Found a small apartment in the civilian quarter, paid 3 months' rent in advance, and settled into the business of being nobody in particular. For 2 weeks, it seemed to work. He took odd jobs around the station, cargo loading, equipment maintenance, anything that kept his hands busy and his mind quiet. The work was honest, the pay was fair, and nobody cared about his past. Then the Zephyr's pride arrived. Was in the station's small commissary, nursing a cup of synthetic coffee and reading local shipping reports, when he heard the familiar whine of diplomatic engines. Through the viewport, he could see the sleek lines of a vessel settling into one of the premium docking bays. His stomach tightened as he recognized the ship's configuration, the same class that had been docked at Meridian Gate. Could be a coincidence, he told himself, but 30 years of survival instincts told him otherwise. Fancy ship, commented the woman who ran the commissary. Her cybernetic implants whirred softly as she tracked the vessel's approach. Don't see many diplomatic plates out here. Wonder what brings royalty to our little corner of nowhere. Finished his coffee and stood, probably just a fuel stop. But as he made his way back to his apartment, he caught glimpses of emerald-scaled figures moving through the station's corridors. The young prince and his entourage were conducting what looked like a methodical search, showing pictures to station personnel and asking questions. Damn! Made it halfway to his quarters before he heard the familiar voice behind him. Staff Sergeant. He stopped, his shoulders tensing involuntarily. When he turned, Prince was standing 10 feet away, flanked by Lady and 2 guards. But something had changed in the young's bearing. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like uncertainty. Your Highness, said carefully, Haven Station's a long way from the trade routes. What brings you to our little backwater? You do, the prince replied simply. I came to apologize. Blinked, certain he had misheard. Come again. I said I came to apologize. Prince stepped forward, his golden eyes steady. At Meridian Gate, I spoke from ignorance and prejudice. I insulted you, your service, and the memory of every human who died in the Void War. I was wrong, and I'm sorry. The corridor had fallen silent around them. Station personnel stopped their work to stare at the unprecedented sight of royalty, apologizing to a human civilian. Felt the familiar weight of unwanted attention, but there was something in the prince's voice that kept him from simply walking away. You didn't need to come all this way to say that, said. Yes, I did. The prince's voice carried new conviction. After you left the cantina, I had Lady research your service record. I learned about the Void War, the real story that our history books conveniently omitted. I learned about the Battle of Station, the liberation of Prime's moon, the transport ship rescue that earned you the Silver Talon. Flinched at the mention of that last mission. The transport ship had been a nightmare of twisted metal and transformed passengers, half consumed by a darkness entity that had turned living beings into extensions of its hunger. He had spent 3 days cutting survivors out of that hell, carrying them one by one to the evacuation shuttles while the ship slowly digested itself around him. You read the reports, he said flatly. I did, all of them. Prince's scales rippled with what recognized as shame, including Admiral's personal assessments of human military capabilities. I know what you and your people sacrificed to save the galaxy. I know why you looked at me the way you did in that cantina. Do you? Asked, his voice taking on an edge. Do you really understand what you're talking about, kid? The guards tensed at the implied threat in his tone, but Prince held up a hand to stop them. I understand that you've seen things that would break most beings. I understand that when you looked at me, you saw a spoiled child playing at being a warrior. And I understand that walking away from my challenge was an act of mercy, not cowardice. Studied the young prince's face, looking for the arrogance that had been there before. He found none, only a kind of hollow awareness that spoke of illusions shattered and comfortable lies stripped away. Why? Asked. Why does it matter to you what one old soldier thinks? Because I'm going to be a leader someday, Prince replied. And leaders who don't understand the cost of war make decisions that get good people killed. My grandfather ruled during the Void War, and he never told me the truth about humanity's role in it. He let me grow up thinking you were primitives and cowards. The prince's voice grew stronger. When I take the throne, I won't make that mistake. I'll know who my real allies are, and I'll remember what they've sacrificed. Felt something shift inside him, a recognition of sincerity that he hadn't expected from the arrogant young noble he'd met at Meridian Gate. You came a long way to learn a lesson, Your Highness. Some lessons are worth traveling for, the prince replied, and some apologies need to be delivered in person. Before could respond, the station's emergency alarms began blaring. Red lights flashed along the corridor walls, and an automated voice echoed through the speakers. All personnel to emergency stations. Hostile vessels detected approaching the system. This is not a drill. The transformation in was instantaneous and complete. The tired civilian facade fell away like a discarded coat, replaced by the sharp focus of a veteran soldier assessing a threat. His posture changed, his eyes hardened, and suddenly Prince was looking at the man who had held communication, arrays against impossible odds. How many ships? Asked, his voice cutting through the alarm noise. Lady consulted a handheld device. Station sensors detect 4 vessels, configuration unknown. They're not responding to communication attempts, and they're jamming our long-range transmitters. Pirates, said grimly. Haven Station's isolated enough to be a tempting target, and the communication jamming means they don't want anyone calling for help. He turned to the prince. Your ship armed. Diplomatic vessel, Prince replied. Light defensive systems only, nothing that could stand up to a dedicated attack. Was already moving, heading toward the station's command center with the following. Then, we need to get you off this station before they dock. Pirates in this sector don't usually take prisoners, especially not valuable ones. The command center was in chaos when they arrived. Station administrator, a nervous with twitching antennae, was trying to coordinate a defense with the few security officers at his disposal. The main display showed 4 sleek ships approaching Haven Station, their hulls painted in the mottled patterns favored by rim raiders. Estimated time to docking? Asked, pushing through the crowd of personnel. 18 minutes, reported the sensor operator, a young human woman with trembling hands. Sir, they're targeting our communications array and defensive systems. They know exactly what they're doing. Studied the tactical display with the practiced eye of someone who had analyzed far deadlier threats. Raiders, he said after a moment. See those hull modifications? They're specialists in station assault. Fast, efficient, and they don't leave witnesses. Administrator Santeni drooped. We can't fight them. Our security force has 12 officers and basic energy weapons. They'll cut through us like paper. Maybe, said, his mind racing through possibilities. Or maybe they'll underestimate what they're facing. Prince stepped forward. Staff Sergeant, my guards and I will assist in the defense. No, replied firmly. You'll get to your ship and you'll run, that's an order. The prince's golden eyes flashed with indignation. You can't order me to abandon these people. I can and I am. Turned to face him fully, and the prince saw something in those brown eyes that made his argument die in his throat. Kid, I appreciate the sentiment, but this isn't a game. Those raiders will be here in 17 minutes, and when they arrive, they're going to find a station full of scared civilians and a handful of security guards. Exactly why we should. Listen to me, interrupted, his voice carrying the authority of command. In about 5 minutes, I'm going to start making decisions that will get people killed. Some of those people might be raiders, some might be station personnel, and if you stay here, some might be royalty. I've got enough blood on my hands without adding yours to the collection. Prince stared at him, understanding dawning. You're going to fight them. I'm going to defend this station, corrected. There's a difference, and you don't want to learn what it is. The alarms continued blaring as the prince wrestled with his decision. Everything in his upbringing told him to stand and fight, to prove his courage in battle. But the look in his eyes, the way the other station personnel had unconsciously started deferring to the former sergeant's authority, told him that this was not his fight. How do you know you can win? Prince asked. Smile was cold and predatory. I don't, but I know I can make them pay a price they weren't expecting. He turned to administrator. I need a complete station schematic, personnel roster, and inventory of anything that can be used as a weapon. I also need someone to get the civilians to the lower decks and seal the blast doors. You're taking command, the asked. Unless you've got someone else with military experience, replied, because right now that's what this station needs. Relief was palpable. What do you need from us? Everything you've got, said grimly. And prepare yourself for what's coming, because once I start this, there's no going back. Prince watched as the tired old soldier transformed into something far more dangerous. Orders flowed from with crisp efficiency, station personnel snapping to follow his instructions with the unconscious obedience that came from recognizing competence in a crisis. Your Highness, Lady said quietly, we should depart. The prince nodded reluctantly, but as he turned to go, caught his arm. When this is over, said, his voice lowered so only the prince could hear, you're going to hear stories about what happened here. People will call it heroic or necessary or a dozen other things that make it easier to sleep at night. But I want you to remember something. What? War isn't glorious, it's not noble, it's just people killing other people until one side decides they've had enough. Script tightened slightly. The reason I walked away from your challenge wasn't because I was afraid of losing, it was because I was afraid of winning. Prince met his eyes, seeing in them depths of experience that no amount of theoretical study could convey. I understand. No, you don't, replied, but maybe someday you will, and when that day comes, I hope you remember what real strength looks like. He released the prince's arm and turned back to the tactical display. Lady, get him out of here. And when you get back to space, make sure the Historical Council knows what really happened during the Void War. People should understand what they owe humanity. The delegation left the command center, moving quickly toward their ship. As they walked, Prince could hear his voice echoing through the station's communication system, calm and authoritative as he positioned personnel and improvised defenses. Docking Bay 7, I need those fuel lines rigged as improvised explosives. Engineering, can you overload the main reactor enough to create a controlled electromagnetic pulse? Security Team Alpha, fall back to 3 and prepare for close quarters combat. The Zephyr's Pride undocked as the first Raider ship began its attack run on the station's defensive systems. Through the viewports, Prince watched as Haven Station's few defensive turrets opened fire, their energy beams striking the attacking vessels with little visible effect. Then the station itself seemed to come alive. Docking bays erupted in controlled explosions as improvised mines detonated beneath the raiders' ships. The main reactor pulsed with overloaded energy, sending electromagnetic waves through the station's hull that disabled half the attackers' electronic systems. Emergency blast doors slammed shut in precise sequences, channeling the boarding parties into killing fields where station personnel waited with improvised weapons and desperate courage. By the ancient skis, Lady whispered, watching the tactical display, he's turning the entire station into a weapon. The battle lasted 4 hours. When it ended, 3 of the 4 Raider ships had been destroyed, and the 4th was limping away into deep space with half its crew dead and its captain swearing never to return to the sector. Haven Station had survived, though the cost had been higher than anyone wanted to count. 6 months later, Prince stood before the Historical Council, presenting his complete report on humanity's role in the Void War. The assembled nobles and scholars listened in stunned silence as he detailed the true scope of human sacrifice and the debt owed to Earth's children. When he finished, the chamber was quiet for a long moment. "Are you certain of these facts?" asked Elder, the council's senior member. "I've them through multiple sources," the prince replied, "including personal accounts from our own military leaders who served during the war." Elder's scales rippled thoughtfully. "This puts our recent diplomatic policies in a rather poor light. We've been treating humanity as junior partners in the galactic community." "With respect, Elder, they never asked to be treated as anything else," Prince said. "That's part of what makes them remarkable. They saved the galaxy and then went home, asking for nothing in return." "And this soldier you encountered what became of him?" The prince's expression grew somber. "He defended Haven Station against a raider attack and disappeared shortly afterward. Some say he died in the battle, others claim he found passage to the Outer Rim. I've had investigators searching for him for months with no success." "Why is finding him so important to you?" Prince was quiet for a moment, remembering brown eyes that had seen too much and a voice that spoke of weights no one should have to carry. "Because he taught me something that no amount of formal education could provide," he said finally. "He taught me the difference between strength and violence, between courage and recklessness. He showed me what real leadership looks like when everything is on the line." Elder nodded slowly. "Very well. This council accepts your findings and recommends immediate revision of our historical records regarding the Void War. We also recommend enhanced diplomatic outreach to human colonies and trade partners." As the council session ended, Prince stood at the great windows of the assembly hall, looking out at the stars of space. Somewhere out there, an old soldier was probably still running from memories that would never fade. But his teachings lived on in the mind of a young prince who would someday rule and who would remember the price of peace. The galaxy was a vast place, full of wonders and terrors in equal measure. But it was also a place where tired veterans could find redemption by passing their wisdom to the next generation, and where spoiled princes could learn what it truly meant to serve. In the end, perhaps that was the most human thing of all, the belief that people could change, grow, and become better than they were. It was a lesson worth traveling across the galaxy to learn, and worth carrying forward into whatever future awaited among the stars. Might have disappeared into the vast emptiness between worlds, but his impact rippled outward like waves from a stone thrown into still water. The prince he had taught would become a king who valued wisdom over bravado. The station he had saved would become a beacon of hope on the frontier, and the truth he had helped uncover would ensure that humanity's sacrifice was never forgotten. Sometimes the most important battles were fought not with weapons, but with words and actions that changed hearts and minds. And sometimes the greatest victory was simply walking away, leaving behind seeds of understanding that would grow long after the warrior had moved on. The stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to the struggles of mortals below. But in the hearts and minds of those who had learned what it meant to truly serve, its legacy lived on. And in a galaxy that often forgot its heroes, perhaps that was enough.